Look, I'm not the kind of guy who goes out looking for a fight. Honestly, I've always been more of an live and let live person, but there is something about a certain type of middle-aged woman with a clipboard and a power complex that just rubs me the wrong way. And unfortunately for me, that was exactly what was waiting on my driveway before I'd even managed to get the keys into the front door of my new place. I just pulled the U-Haul into the driveway of this quiet, leafy street in a suburb called Pine Valley. It was supposed to be my fresh start after a messy divorce, and I was literally wiping sweat from my forehead when this silver SUV screeches to a halt right behind my trailer. Out steps a woman who looked like she'd been professionally assembled by a committee of angry librarians. She had these tight, peroxide blonde curls that didn't move an inch in the breeze, oversized sunglasses that covered half her face, and a floral blouse tucked so tightly into her slacks it looked painful. She didn't in oppos. T say hello. She didn't in oppos. T welcomed me to the neighborhood. She just marched up, tapped her pen against a wooden clipboard, and barked, and quote, "You can't park that eyesore here. It's a violation of Section 4, Paragraph B of the Pine Valley Covenant, and I suggest you move it before I have to log your first strike." End quote. I just stood there, holding a box of kitchen appliances, blinking at her like she was speaking a foreign language, and I finally managed to say, end quote, "Ma'am, I've been here for exactly 12 minutes. The engine is probably still warm, so maybe give me a second to actually get my bed inside before we start talking about strikes." End quote. She didn't in oppos. T find that funny at all. Her lips thinned into this tiny, pale line, and she leaned in just enough for me to smell her expensive, floral perfume. The kind that hits you in the back of the throat. And she said, end quote, "I am Mrs. Beatrice Vane, the president of this homeowners association, and in Pine Valley, we value order over convenience. So consider this your only verbal warning, Mr. Sterling." End quote. She scribbled something on her paper, gave my trailer a look of pure disgust, and marched back to her car. And as I watched her drive away, I felt this cold knot in my stomach because I knew right then that Beatrice was an oppos. T just a neighbor. She was a predator who had spent years turning this neighborhood into her own private fiefdom. The next few weeks were a slow-motion nightmare of petty bureaucracy. And I'm telling you, this woman must have had a telescope or a team of spies because the citations started arriving like clockwork, and they were insane. I got a $50 fine because my trash cans were visible from the street for 45 minutes after the garbage truck passed. Even though I was at work, then I got a formal, end quote, notice of noncompliance, end quote, because the mulch I used in my flower bed was a, end quote, burn number, end quote, instead of the HOA approved, end quote, chestnut brown, end quote. And then came the big one, the wind chime. My mother had given me this beautiful, deep-toned copper wind chime before she passed, and I hung it on my back porch where it made this low, melodic sound that helped me sleep. But apparently, in Beatrice's world, music was a disturbance of the peace. I came home to a letter taped to my door, not in an envelope, mind you, but taped right there for the world to see, stating that, end quote, unauthorized acoustic devices, end quote, were prohibited and that I owed the HOA $100 for the, end quote, emotional distress, end quote, caused to my neighbors. I was fuming. I was sitting on my porch that night listening to my, end quote, illegal, end quote, chime, and I realized that Beatrice thought I was just some defenseless guy who'd sunk his life savings into a mortgage and was now at her mercy. But what she didn't know, what she had in oppos, T bothered to check because she was too busy measuring my grass with a ruler, was that I don in oppos. T just work in real estate. I specialize in commercial land acquisition and distressed assets. About 4 years ago, my firm, Sterling Holdings, had picked up a weird little parcel of land right on the edge of this development during a complicated foreclosure sale. It included a small wooded area and a fairly large, modern building that the previous developer had intended to use as a sales office. But when the market crashed, it got separated from the residential deeds. Guess what that building was? It was the Pine Valley Community Clubhouse, the very place where the HOA held their monthly meetings, their holiday parties, and their little, end quote, tribunals, end quote, where they decided which neighbor to ruin next. The HOA didn't end oppos. T owned the building, they leased it, and they'd been leasing it from a holding company that they clearly hadn't end oppos. T bothered to investigate in years, and when I looked up the current lease agreement in my office files that night, I started laughing so hard I nearly choked on my coffee because the lease was up for a mandatory usage review in exactly 10 days. I decided to play it cool. I didn't oppose. T respond to the wind chime fine. I didn't oppose. T changed my mulch. I just waited for the next board meeting, which was conveniently scheduled for the following Tuesday evening. I walked into that clubhouse wearing my best tailored suit. I wanted to look like the landlord, not the victim, and the room was packed with about 40 residents, most of them looking tired and defeated as they listened to Beatrice drone on about the, sanctity of the suburban aesthetic, She was standing at a mahogany podium at the front of the room, looking like a queen addressing her subjects. And when she saw me walk in and take a seat in the front row, she actually stopped mid-sentence and smirked. Mr. Sterling, how nice of you to join us, She said in the microphone, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, Though I hope you brought your checkbook because we have several outstanding matters regarding your property to discuss in the executive session. I didn't oppose. T say a word. I just pulled a thick blue folder out of my briefcase and set on the table in front of me. And I waited through 40 minutes of her complaining about, unauthorized garden gnomes and, rogue basketball hoops, until she finally opened the floor for, other business, I stood up, and the room went quiet. I could feel the eyes of my neighbors on me, some of them probably wondering if I was about to beg for mercy. But I just looked straight at Beatrice and said, Actually, Beatrice, I'm not here as a homeowner tonight. I'm here as the managing director of Sterling Holdings, and I'm afraid we need to discuss the future of this facility. Beatrice looked confused for a second. She adjusted her glasses and said, I don and oppose. TC how your business interests are relevant to this meeting. Please sit down, But I just walked right up to the front and laid the lease agreement on her podium. It's relevant because as of 3 years ago, my company owns this building, and according to the INOPOS, right of inspection and oppose, clause in Section 9, I'm here to inform the board that your current lease is being placed under immediate and oppose, high-risk review and oppose, due to several reports of hostile management practices occurring on the premises, The color drained from her face so fast it was like someone had pulled a plug. She looked down at the document, then back at me, then at the other board members who were suddenly whispering frantically to each other. You can oppose. TB the owner, She stammered, her voice losing that sharp, authoritative edge, The lease is with a company called Greystone Assets, And I just smiled and said, Greystone was a subsidiary we folded into Sterling last year, Beatrice. Maybe if you spent less time measuring my mulch and more time reading your legal correspondence, you'd have known that. I turned around to face the audience, who were now leaning forward in their chairs, some of them actually grinning, and I said loudly, The lease also states that the landlord has the right to terminate with 30 days in oppose. Notice if the tenant in oppose, activities in oppose, negatively impact the reputation of the property, and oppose. So from this moment on, every single fine issued to a resident of Pine Valley needs to be justified to my office, or I'm going to find a new tenant for this building. Maybe a 24-hour martial arts gym or a low-income daycare center. I haven and oppose. T decided yet, and Beatrice looked like she was having a physical breakdown. She was clutching her clipboard so hard her knuckles were white, and she tried to regain control by shouting that I was, obstructing the governance of the community, but the residents weren't and oppose. T having it anymore. One guy in the back stood up and started clapping, and pretty soon the whole room was a chaos of people shouting out their own grievances. I walked out of that building feeling 10 feet tall, but I knew Beatrice wooed and oppose. T go down that easy. Bullies like her never do. They just get more desperate and more dangerous when they're cornered. Sure enough, a few nights later, I'm sitting in my darkened living room around 2 a.m. because I've been having trouble sleeping, and I see a flicker of light out by my mailbox. I look through the blinds, and I see a figure dressed in a dark hoodie and sweatpants, hunched over my home Thursday with what looks like a crowbar. I didn't oppose. T call out, I didn't oppose. T run outside. I just picked up my phone and started recording with the high-definition security system I'd installed the day after the Clubhouse meeting. The person was systematically prying the door off my mailbox, and then, I kid you not, they started pouring some kind of thick, oily liquid all over the wooden post. When they finished, they turned around to check the street, and the street lamp hit their face perfectly. It was Beatrice, her face twisted into this expression of pure, ugly rage that made her look like a completely different person. She actually kicked the mailbox one last time before scurrying away into the shadows toward her own house 3 blocks over. The next morning, I didn't an oppose to even go outside to check the damage. I just took the footage straight to the local police station, and then, for good measure, I called the postal inspector's office because people often forget that tampering with a mailbox ISN and oppose. Just a neighborhood spat. It's a federal crime in this country. 2 days later, I'm drinking my morning coffee when 3 police cruisers and a plain black sedan pull up in front of Beatrice's pristine white house. They didn't and oppose. Just give her a ticket. They walked her out in handcuffs while she was still in her silk bathrobe, screaming about, in quote, constitutional rights, in quote, and in quote, harassment, in quote. It turns out when the police search her house, they didn't and oppose. Just find a crowbar and the oil she used on my property. They found a filing cabinet in her basement filled with years of illegal surveillance she'd been doing on the neighbors, hundreds of photos of people in their backyards, logs of when people left for work, and, most importantly, second set of accounting books for the HOA. This is where it gets really dark, and is why I think we need to talk more about these organizations, because once the county auditors got involved, they discovered that Beatrice and the HOA treasurer, a guy named Arthur who always looked like he was about to burst out of his sweater, had been running a massive kickback scheme. They had been hiring and, quote, landscaping company, in quote, owned by Beatrice and oppose, as brother-in-law to do, in quote, emergency repairs, in quote. That never actually happened, and they'd funneled nearly $80,000 of our dues into a private account over the last 5 years. But the worst part was the and, quote, foreclosure pipeline, in quote. They would target elderly residents or people going through hard times with a barrage of daily fines until the debt became so large the HOA could place a lien on the house, and then they'd pressure the owners to sell at a loss to a, in quote, preferred investor, in quote, who was, you guessed it, another one of Beatrice's relatives. They weren't and oppose. Just being annoying. They were systematically stealing people and oppose, as homes and their futures under the guise of, in quote, community standards, end quote. The fallout was spectacular. The entire board resigned within a week to avoid being named in the racketeering lawsuit, and Beatrice ended up taking a plea deal that involved a heavy fine and several years of probation. But she had to sell her house in Pine Valley just to pay her legal fees. She's living in a tiny apartment on the other side of the county now. As for the neighborhood, it was like the sun finally came out after a decade of storms. We held a massive block party in the Clubhouse, which I still own, by the way, though I now lease it to the new, resident-run board for exactly $1 a year. We have a new charter now, one that actually protects people instead of hunting them. And the first thing we did was pass a rule that says no board member is allowed to own a clipboard or a pair of binoculars. I'm sitting on my porch now, as I tell you this, and the wind is blowing just enough to make my mother's copper chimes sing. And I can see my neighbor across the street painting his front door bright, in quote, unauthorized, in quote, shade of electric blue, and honestly, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. But it makes me wonder how many other, in quote, Pine Valleys, in quote, are out there right now. How many people are being bullied in their own homes by someone like Beatrice because they think they don and oppose, to have the power to fight back. I got lucky because of my job, but most people don and oppose, to have a lease agreement in their back pocket, and that's the real problem, ISN and oppose. We give these tiny, private governments so much power over our lives and our property, and then we're surprised when that power turns into poison. So I want to know what you think. Is there ever a, in quote, good, in quote, HOA? Or is the whole system just a breeding ground for petty tyrants? Have you ever had to stand up to a bully in your own neighborhood? And did you win? Or did you have to walk away? Let me know in the comments, because I think it's time we start sharing these stories before more people lose their homes to someone with a clipboard and a grudge.